At some point during your school days, there's a good chance you read The Lottery, Shirley Jackson's timeless tale about the absolute last raffle you'd want to win. If you haven't read it, feel free to pause the video and go fix your life because I'm about to spoil it. The story here is dead simple. This small farming community gets together on the eve of their harvest for a yearly tradition. They're going to hold a lottery, and everyone has to participate. This, of course, makes you want to know what the lottery is for, but you don't find that out until the story culminates with one of the most shocking endings in all of fiction, where a completely innocent person gets stoned to death. While worse things have happened to other characters in other stories, it's not just the stoning that makes the lottery so haunting, it's that right up to it, the characters seem pretty normal. They're not raging psychopaths, they're not sadistic monsters, they're the sort of people who could be your neighbors. And though the story ends right at the start of this heinous act, you get the sense that if it kept going, the characters afterwards would not be screaming, "Oh God, what have we done?" They'd be more like, "Alright, great job everyone, see you at the picnic." While the quote-unquote meaning of the lottery is open to some interpretation, at the very least I'm sure we can agree that it's a cautionary tale about the dangers of blindly following an established custom, and a brilliant depiction of the madness of crowds, and how people in them can wind up doing things as a group that they'd never do as individuals. While it's hard to think of a better story about the madness of crowds, there's two others that come close and that I think you're gonna love, because who doesn't love a dystopian nightmare that depresses the absolute shit out of you? Up first is The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas by Ursula K. Le Guin. If you haven't read it, feel free to do so, but just be ready, it's a bit of a gut punch. The story, if you can call it that, is more of a description of a perfect city, Omelas, where life is wonderful. There's no crime, there's no poverty, and everybody's happy. Except for this one poor child who's kept locked in a basement, fed scraps, treated brutally, and spends the entirety of his short life in agony. Told ya, gut punch. What's worse is that it's not a secret that this is happening. Everyone in the city knows. People are even encouraged to go see the child for themselves, and most do at least once in their life, kind of like a pilgrimage, and seeing the child is terrible for them. Despite what you might think, the people of Omelas are not heartless. They're as compassionate as you or I, yet no one ever makes any effort to save the child. The reason, as Le Guin explains, is they know that everything they love and cherish about their city depends wholly on this child's abominable misery. If that doesn't make a tremendous amount of sense to you,
Hey, what?
welcome to the club. Even compared to the lottery, where the characters' actions are no less insane, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas still doesn't seem to add up. At least with the lottery, you can understand why the characters do what they do. The idea of making a sacrifice in order to ensure a good harvest is hardly new. It's been done before, so you don't have to think of the lottery as a metaphor for something else. Shirley Jackson even said her story was not a metaphor. It's about what it's about. But The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas feels like it has to be about more than what's just on the page, which raises the question, what exactly? To answer that, let's look at one more story about the madness of crowds, Never Let Me Go, a feature film adapted by Alex Garland from a novel of the same name by Kazuo Ishiguro. This story starts at a boarding school where the students seem normal enough, but something is just a little off. For one thing, there's never any mention of parents or siblings. For another, the kids need to be taught basic human interactions, like ordering in restaurants, and lastly, whenever outsiders visit, they are creeped out by these kids. Eventually, our suspicions that something ain't right about this place are confirmed in the worst possible way when a rogue teacher decides to tell the students why they're really here.
Before you're even middle-aged, you will start to donate your vital organs.
Basically, to serve as spare parts for people on the outside. Much like the revelation of the child, or learning the purpose of the lottery, this news is shockingly awful, and yet I feel compelled to point out that at least here the benefit to society is real. It's not merely superstitious like in the lottery, or allegorical like in The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. It's tangible. Who wouldn't want to live in a world where you or a loved one gets to survive a diagnosis that today you wouldn't? And while it's true that the way this medical miracle is accomplished is socially horrifying, if you lived in this society and you benefited from the donor program, there's a good chance you'd go along with it and that you'd do so without feeling like you're a bad person. After all, it's not like you're responsible for the existence of the program, society is. And you don't blame yourself for the ills of society, do you? Like if you saw a homeless guy on the street or a dolphin choking on a plastic bag, I'm sure you'd feel bad, but you wouldn't feel like it's your fault, would you? So why should these delivery guys feel guilty about these kids? They're not the ones keeping them there. Neither there are these old couples you occasionally see walking in the background. It's not their fault their lives have been extended by this completely innocent group of kids who've been denied ownership over their own bodies. What are they supposed to do? Say no thanks? Keep your organs to yourself? I'd rather die young? What good would that do? It wouldn't end the donor program. It would just mean everyone else benefits except them. And before you go feeling terrible for these kids, they are not saints, okay? They do all the same shitty things to each other that the rest of us do. Consider the saga of the three main characters, Kathy, Ruth, and Tommy. So Kathy likes Tommy and the feeling's mutual, but this makes Ruth jealous, so she steals Tommy for herself. And despite Tommy being unhappy, he is so gullible that it takes him years to end their relationship, by which point Kathy is no longer around. It's not until these three are well into adulthood that Kathy, who's become a caretaker for donor people, gets the three of them back together, whereupon Ruth confesses that she feels really bad about what she did and would like these two to forgive her.
It's the worst thing I ever did.
Kathy and Tommy aren't quick to do so since Ruth cost them years they could have been together and will never get back since they'll be dead soon. But Ruth tells them she thinks there's a way for them to be granted an exemption where they'll be able to live like normal people. They just have to prove to the powers that be that they're worthy of such a privilege. Of course, that gives these two hope that Ruth's plan will work.
You know, hope is a mistake.
And spoiler alert, it doesn't. They are told in no uncertain terms that there's nothing they could ever do to prove themselves worthy enough to leave the donor program, for the simple reason that if society were to acknowledge that even a single person in the program didn't deserve to be there, it would establish a precedent that would eventually lead to the entire thing falling apart, and society will never allow that to happen because the benefit is too great, and because everyone's used to it by this point. It's been normalized. Nobody's gonna voluntarily give that up, not when it's easier to look the other way and tell yourself that you're not responsible for what other people do, even if you're doing the exact same thing. Until making this video, I'd only seen Never Let Me Go once, well over 10 years ago, but I still remember afterwards feeling so broken that I couldn't move. I just sat there in the dark for a long time feeling sad, but also feeling like I just witnessed something incredible that I'd never forget. Similar to The Lottery, Never Let Me Go can be interpreted literally. You don't have to look outside the plot for deeper meaning. It's heartbreaking all by itself. But similar to the ones who walk away from Ominous, you get the sense that the story is about more than just what happens in it. For one, it's not hard to imagine who the donor kids could be a parable for. You unfortunately have several options there. But I don't think the story is just a parable for the suffering of others. Even as nightmarishly weird as this tale is, it feels eerily relatable. As Kathy says,
maybe none of us really understand what we've lived through, or feel we've had enough time.
That's true whether you live in a dystopia or not. A lot of what happens to these three will sadly happen to just about everyone, whether it's regretting something you did when you were young, wishing you could do things over but knowing you can't, feeling like a pawn in a game you have no control over, or just knowing that your time is short and you won't get to be with those you love for as long as you wish you could. Honestly, by the time this story ends, you feel like you're in the donor program, and I think that's why it hits so hard. You start off feeling terrible for the characters, but you wind up feeling terrible for everyone, including yourself. Because the movie was so sad, I put off reading the book for years, but I'm glad I finally got around to it. Both versions are great, and both basically tell the same tale, but with a few key differences that I'll let you discover for yourself. So if you're the sort of person who avoids sad stories because life is depressing enough already, I get it, but occasionally I think you gotta make an exception and just give in to the sadness. Avoiding something because you don't want to feel sad or upset is understandable, but it can lead you to miss out on things, like a great book or movie. Or it might just lead you to become complicit in something monstrous.
We call that the old switcheroo in showbiz.
How's the saying go? In order for evil to prevail, good people just have to do nothing, something like that. That's what these stories are ultimately about. Like, in my mind, there's lots of people in the society of Never Let Me Go who must be appalled by the donor program, but who don't do anything about it. Just like I'm sure there's characters in The Lottery who inwardly wonder if what they're doing is wrong, but do it anyway. And we already know there's people in Ominous who feel terrible about the child. Returning to my earlier question of what that story could be an allegory for, I don't know. Maybe it's about how people can justify justify anything that's convenient for them. Or maybe it's about how people can do terrible things once they get into large enough groups and can pass the blame around. Or maybe the child represents something awful that you know is happening, but that you don't do anything about because you don't think it's your responsibility and it's easier to do nothing. Whatever the case, of these 3 stories, the ones who walk away from Omelas actually has the happiest ending. There are people who refuse to go along with the status quo. Even though they can't stop what's happening to the child, they still refuse to benefit from something they find morally reprehensible, so instead they do the only thing they can do. They leave. They walk away from Omelas. And in doing so, they become the heroes of the story, which seems like an uplifting ending, but true to form, Le Guin makes it so that what happens to those who walk away is almost as depressing as what happens to the child. Why? Because there's nowhere to walk to. Those who walk away are walking to their deaths. And those are your choices if you live in Omelas. You can either have everything you want, whatever the perfect life looks like to you, but you have to be complicit in harming this poor child, who you will feel terrible for, but you won't feel responsible for. Or you can refuse to play any part in harming the child, despite there being no repercussions for you doing so, and instead walk away from an otherwise blissful existence, knowing full well there's nowhere to walk to, and that your actions will likely have no meaningful impact on the society you're walking away from. Those are your choices. And those are my thoughts on 3 excellent stories about the madness of crowds. Let me know what you think. Be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe. It really helps the channel. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next time.
What I'm not sure about is if our lives have been so different from the lives of the people we save.